In the realm of parables, this has to be one of the most convoluted, confusing, bizarre parables you're going to come across in the Bible. For those of you who didn't catch it, let's just break down the parable for a second, because I think what happens to most people is they run across this really weird parable, they try to tackle it, and then they're just like, oh, forget it, there's like 70 more of these, I'll catch on whatever the theme was. Okay? And I think what throws us in this parable is that when we see there is a rich man who had much property, okay, we immediately assume that person's got to be God. And so this is going to be a parable about God and us. And it's not. Because it doesn't work at all if it's God and us, right? Because basically, let me walk you through the parable in case you didn't quite follow. You have a guy who's a rich business owner. He's got an accountant. The accountant is embezzling money from him, okay? Yay. Great guy. So he's embezzling money from his boss. So then his boss says basically, hey, we've been researching it. You need to hand over the books. We're going to check the books, and you're probably fired. Because unless you can account for all this money that's missing, you're out of here. So the guy goes and thinks to himself, man, I am too lazy to work an honest day's work, and I'm too prideful to beg for money, so I can't do those things. So what will I do? Ooh, I know. Since I have the books for one more day before I have to hand them over, I have one more chance to embezzle. So what I'll do is I'll go to all the third-party vendors that my boss works with. I'll ask them, how much do you owe my boss? Okay? And I'll write off their loans, and then they'll owe me political favors so that when I get fired, I at least have a couch to crash on, if not another job they could get me. Because they'll owe me for helping them embezzle from my boss too. I mean, this guy's a winner. Okay? Now here's the problem. Up to that point, you could still hold, well, okay, God's the person and this is about unfaithfulness. However, the next thing the boss does is he walks in and says, you're fired. By the way, brilliant idea with the embezzlement the second time around. You are one shrewd agent. High five. That should have been clue one. That ain't God. Because God is not high-fiving embezzlement. Okay? And just sort of laughs with the guy and says, go for it. I'm sure you have another job lined up. Way to go. Okay? And then you sort of pull out of the parable for a second, and you have Jesus sort of commenting on his own story, which is weird enough. And he says a few interesting things. He says the people of this generation, now that's the people he's talking directly to, are shrewd when it comes to the generation, but not the children of light. First thing we got to remember is we are all children of our generation, whatever generation that is, and we are all children of light. So these aren't two separate groups. Keep that in mind. And then he says, those who are faithful with a little will be faithful with a lot. Those who are dishonest with a little will be dishonest with a lot. Which also doesn't follow if that's God, because he just gave the high five to embezzlement, right? And then he goes on to say, you can't serve both God and wealth. So it's just this sort of bizarre thing, right? So let me back up and walk you through a different way. Let's say the owner isn't God. Let's say the owner is a dude who loves money. Now, I met those folks when I worked in finance. I met the sort of folks that I absolutely believe that if someone ripped them off in a business deal, they would have high-fived the guy out the door as they were being fired, going, man, way to be shrewd. Dude, you got one over on me. Way to go. Next time I'll get you. We've all probably met that person at least once or twice in our life. There are people out there wired that way. Not me, probably not you, but they do exist. Okay? And I think that's the sort of person the business owner is. And I think what this is a commentary on working the systems of the world versus working the systems of God. Because the systems of the world will celebrate with you when you work the systems of the world. But you don't get to do both all the time. And I think what Jesus is reminding folks is, yeah, the dishonest guy was liked by his dishonest boss. Big whoop. And then he steps in and says, folks, I wish you'd be as shrewd about what it means to be a Christian as you are about what it means to be a business person. I wish you'd be as shrewd about following the eternal home with God. For good luck finding eternal home with your friends. Their homes are as temporary as yours. Can't serve two gods. See, I think it's really about a real truth that we run into. A real truth where we get torn between two games that we can most of the time balance, but not always. Because sometimes they run into each other. But before I go there, I want to address two sort of random things, but it has to be addressed. Too often, because this is such a confusing sort of story, what ends up happening is we ignore it, we leave it behind, we figure we'll pick it up somewhere else in the Bible in one of those other chapters. But that leaves us vulnerable. And vulnerable to something that happens to the story a lot, which is someone comes in, they grab onto an itty-bitty piece of the story, and then they draw a giant, beautiful political sermon out of it. Okay? And there are two political sermons you can draw out of this. I'm going to tell you right now, both of them are wrong. Because both of them don't make any sense once you address the actual parable itself. So I'm going to go beat up on the right, and then I'll beat up on the left. Don't worry. So all the Republicans, you'll be mad at me for the next 2 minutes, and then all the Democrats will be mad at me for the 2 minutes after that, okay? So at least everyone will be equally upset with me or equally happy. That's the other way this could go. So, one thing that often gets pulled out of this from the right is to go ahead and look at you're faithful with a little, you can be faithful with a lot. If you're dishonest with a little, you'll be dishonest with a lot. Joel Osteen, a favorite kicking bag of mine, is one of those who really digs down on this. And what they'll do is they'll say, well, see, if you're faithful with a little money, God will give you more money. If you're dishonest with a little money, God will make you poor. That is not at all how God works, folks. That is not at all what this entire story is about. Because if you look at the story, the dishonest dude pulled off his shrewd campaign to get another job. If anything, the dishonest guy is going to go on to have a pretty good life on this world. So it's not about that. It's not moralizing the poor, trying to argue that the poor are somehow less moral than the rich. They're not. There's just no connection, and there's definitely no connection to the Bible or this story when it comes to that sort of philosophy. The poor are no more moral or less moral than the rich. Okay? Flip side, okay, so I've now made all the Republicans really upset. Now to make Democrats upset. So at the end of the story, folks, it says you cannot serve both wealth and God. So another way I've seen people sort of spin this story out is to say, ha ha, I knew it, we should get rid of money. Yeah, okay. Right? We should just end all of capitalism. Can't be God and wealth. Boom. Over. Drop mic. Okay, folks, no, that is not what this is saying. Okay? We're not saying you can't do both. You cannot exist in a capitalist world and a moral structure. Yes, you can. Okay? This is not the commentary. If that was the commentary, then you wouldn't have had the dishonest guys again pull it off, right? They would have been burning in hell at the end of this, or there would have been some sort of punishment, or at least rebuke of what they did, right? So I don't think that's what this Bible passage is getting at. It's not a commentation on who the poor are, who the rich are, what economic system you should or should not use. I don't think he's making a commentary on that, and so neither am I. But those who want to make that commentary, that I would push back against and say, nah, I don't think you have good grounds in either of those two directions with this passage. So then what is it about? Like, what is this actually about? We know what it's not about. We sort of know what happened, but why this passage? What is Jesus trying to lead us to? Well, I think he's trying to lead us to two important things. The first one, I do think, comes from that idea of if you're dishonest with a little, you'll be dishonest with a lot. If you're honest with a little, you'll be honest with a lot. First thing, very basic level, that's not bad advice for like daily living. If you have an employee who's dishonest with little things, It won't be long if you give them lots of responsibilities before they're dishonest with big things too. Those of you who have been supervisors, you probably lived this. Those of you who are dating people, if the person you're dating is dishonest with little things, that is a red flag that they're very likely to be dishonest with big things too. Okay? So don't just ignore those little lies, because sometimes they lead to bigger problems. So on a basic level, it's good advice. But I think there's a deeper advice on the communal level, not so much the individual, but on the communal level, which is, remember last week we talked about how our job was to be good sheep, because it was God's job to go out there and find a lost sheep and bring them back to one of many of his folds, right? We still have to be his fold when he returns. Those of us who are faithful as communities, God will bring the lost sheep to. Those who are not faithful as communities, God will not bring the lost sheep to. For communities like ours that are growing, this is good news. For communities that are shrinking, this is hard news. And we all know this from experience. Those of us who grew up like I did in a small church that was struggling. That often it was that thing that you couldn't say or you couldn't do, or anyone from the outside would say, well, haven't you thought of? And then everyone would say, well, you can't say that out loud. Right? That was the thing that was killing the church. The fact you can't say it out loud in a lot of little churches out there is exactly why when you're dishonest with a little thing, you're not entrusted with a bigger. It's not about your personal wealth and personal management, but it is about communal health and God's willingness to be in a community. Now, the other part of it that I do think is very personal is this idea of you can't serve two masters, both God and wealth. And I think he picks wealth in this particular because I think that's sort of the story we have. Right? The dishonest manager could have decided to be honest or could have decided to make money. There was a clash at that moment, right? Could have done one or the other. Can't do both. Let me give you an example from my own life. So y'all know I worked in finance, and one of my first jobs in finance was a personal banker, which sounds really cool, but I'm the person who opens your checking account. Sit at the little desk, and I open your checking account and I give you a little checkbook, and if you have a complaint, you go to me first. So there's like tellers, personal bankers. Okay? So I'm definitely not high on the level. And so I'm there and I'm in New Haven, Connecticut, and I'm working at a bank, and my understanding of how banking fundamentally worked was if 3 people came in and I was the next banker available, I would take the first of the 3 people who came in, right? Unless someone had like a preset meeting. Okay? So I did that for a few months, and then my manager comes in and says, stop, come to my office. I'm like, uh-oh, that's never good. So I go to my manager's office, and my manager's like, okay, we're going to turn on the security camera, we're going to watch the lobby. I was like, okay, we're looking at the lobby. And she's like, who do you take next? I'm like, that person in the subway suit. And she's like, why? And I'm like, well, because they've been waiting the longest. And she's like, oh my God, okay, that's what I thought. And I'm like, what? And she said, that's not how it works here in Connecticut. Okay? This is how it works. Look at the lobby. See that guy there? And I'm like, yeah, that is an Armani suit. You know who goes next? Dude in Armani suit. Why? Because those are expensive, means he's got money, we get him next. See that woman there? And I'm like, yeah, that is a $1,000 purse. You know what? She goes next. And I'm like, but they came in after the subway person. And she looked at me, and she's like, are you stupid? And I was like, no. I don't think so. I got like a question mark now in my own brain, right? And she's like, so that's what I want you to do. And I'm like, no. And she looks at me and she's like, why? And I'm like, well, first problem I got with it is, isn't it sort of like, racist? She looks at me like I'm the dumbest person she's ever seen in her life. And she's like, no, it is not racist because that would be against bank policy. It's classist. And I'm like, well, can you really separate those two? Because, historical racism, which causes poverty within minority communities, are larger. And she's like, oh, stop lecturing me on politics. I'm like, okay. And so she said, go out there, take the rich folks first. You know they're rich because of what they're wearing. As I went out there, and I took people in order. Needless to say, I did not have that job real long. Didn't technically get fired. I learned early on in my 20s to resign before you got fired. But here's the thing. I had a moment there where I could have done what was in the best interest, honestly, of my own moral character, been a Christian in that moment, and probably done what was best for the bank. I mean, I still would hold that taking people in order is the best idea for any bank anywhere, because treat your clients well, your clients will treat you well back. But people tell me I'm old-fashioned with that idea. Okay? But my boss was probably right. In the short term, when it came to how we individuals on the low end of the spectrum made our commissions, I probably would have gotten higher commissions. All of us in our own lives have these moments, and they only happen every so often, in which our pursuit of being a Christian comes into direct conflict with another pursuit. Whether or not it's wealth or fame or being nice or something else, okay? It can be anything. It doesn't have to be bad, but it has to be something that comes into clash with being a Christian. It's in those moments you decide who your master is. Because in those moments, you can't take people in order, and in order of which they arrived, and in order of their clothing. You just can't. It doesn't work. You got to choose. And whatever you choose, that's your master. At least that day. But here's the weird thing about it. The more you choose one or the other, wealth or God, the harder it is to choose back. The more you choose God, the easier it's to choose God. The more you choose wealth, the easier it is to choose wealth. The harder it is to choose the other. As you go out today, you go out this week, in your lives, in your prayer lives this week, take a few minutes and ask yourself, what are the last 5 times something and God came into conflict in my life? Which master did you choose? And what does that say about your relationship with Christ? One note, Christ will carry back that lost lamb no matter how you answer the question. Just answer it honestly. Amen.